Hi, I'm Lindsey Roy, and I'm about to have a productive conversation with Mike Vardy.
Welcome to A Productive Conversation. I'm Mike Vardy, and today I'm excited to have Lindsey Roy as our guest. She's an author and speaker who has overcome incredible adversity in her life, losing a leg and both lungs. Now, she shares her inspiring story of resilience and finding purpose in her book through her pain via the book, The Gift of Perspective. We discuss her journey and how she's learned to gain perspective even in the most difficult of situations. We explore the power of reframing challenges, embracing vulnerability, and living each day to the fullest. I know you'll be motivated and impacted by Lindsey's wisdom. She has a plethora of experience in the corporate world working for Hallmark. And we dive into a lot of stuff. It's a great conversation. I can't wait for you to hear it, so I'm not going to let you wait any longer. Here's my conversation with Lindsey Roy. Enjoy. Lindsey, thanks so much for taking the time to join me today on A Productive Conversation.
Thank you for having me. I'm super excited to talk to you, Mike.
So the book I'm holding in my hands here is The Gift of Perspective. Now, subtitles are really important when it comes to books. And the title grabs you. However, this subtitle particularly grabbed me, and it will grab most people when they look at the, by the way, beautiful cover. I love the ideas of the paints. It's really beautiful.
Thank you.
The subtitle, Wisdom I Gained from Losing a Leg and Two Lungs. If we're going to go purely from a marketing perspective, there's not much better of a subtitle I think you can get when it comes, it grabs attention. So I want to start there because I think that most people aren't faced with one, let alone two of those life-altering and, in some cases debilitating. Like there's so many things that you can. So I'd love to get a sense of, a bit of the story as to what, as to what happened, but also just a sense of, what led you to, this is a story that I need to share because I know people can learn from this when they don't face the, losing a leg, losing, both lungs. So if we could start there, that would be great.
Yeah, well, I'll say first of all, I appreciate the compliment on the tagline. As you know, I've been at the Hallmark organization, cards and movies and all the stuff we know, and I've been our chief marketing officer. So to hear that from you makes me feel like, awesome. Okay, the tagline did what it was supposed to do. But to your point, the reality is I had to live those things to be able to write that tagline. And in summary, as the book really spells out, I had a fairly normal life, as normal as I guess anybody's life is, until I was 36 years old. Freak accident left me with an amputated leg. About a decade later, freak disease left me with the need for a lung transplant. So here I am, almost a year and a half out from the double lung transplant with my prosthetic leg from the accident a decade earlier, and talking to you about this book. And so why write the book? Why tell my stories? Why do a TED Talk? Why do speaking? All the stuff I do? The short answer is, and I know we'll get into all of these things on our talk today, but I believe that purpose is important. I believe there is purpose in our pain. And one of the things that I felt called to talk about and called to do with my story was to tell it and to try to help people learn from what I've learned. So my story is the background and the metaphor. What really is important is that word wisdom. Like I've learned some things going through these unique roads, and I hope one nugget I can say today or one thing that can be, a standout line in my book will maybe help somebody else. Because we all have stories. I always joke that mine might be sensational or the National Enquirer version, but that doesn't make them harder. I mean, you have things that I don't know. Everybody has stories. And I definitely know that because people tell me stuff now. And everybody has stories, just a lot of them are hidden because there's not like a really appropriate time to walk into a meeting and say, hey, everybody, this freak thing happened to me. You just don't know it.
Right.
But my hope is if I tell my stories, maybe it'll help somebody.
As you bring up like the idea of the stories, there's nuance, all of that stuff involved. One of the things that came up when you were kind of going through in the introduction, and this stood out to me, was when you were talking about the mental silence, the moment of mental silence, and you mentioned, the idea of the movie For the Love of the Game, right? Where the idea of clearing the mechanisms. It's interesting because I think that in that moment, obviously, that's huge, but to me, there's so many times where we need to do that. Can you describe what it means to kind of clear the mechanism?
Now, Mike's talking about is when I had my accident that led to my amputation. It was a boating accident. And the short story is a series of freak things happened that you can never recreate, hence the word accident. And a boat ran over me. And when I was first under the boat, and as I say in my TED talk, dancing with the propeller for those milliseconds, that felt like 20 minutes. I did associate that with the movie For the Love of the Game, where Kevin Costner is on the mound and he closes his eyes and he drowns out the crowd and drowns out all the noise and silence in his brain as he focuses on what pitch he's going to throw. That's what it felt like. And I think those of you who have been through those accident moments or those moments of hearing some difficult news or whatever it is, you do have that moment where it's almost like they depicted on the movies. Everything in your vision goes fuzzy. All the noise kind of drowns out. And that's what happened to me in that moment. And so to your point, I think it's an interesting question because you're essentially alluding to, can we make that moment happen, not just have that moment happen to us? And I think it really comes down to what you're choosing to notice, what you're choosing to focus on, which is this whole idea of perspective. I know, listeners and viewers, before we started, Mike showed me this amazing coffee mug he's using today that has 3 handles. And, he's going to maybe flash it up. There you go right now. And it's depending on where he turns it, you might see 1, 2, or 3 of the handles. And I think that's what life is about, right? Deciding how you see things, what you choose to focus on, and how you drown out everything else to focus on what's at hand.
Well, the other interesting thing about this mug, and I don't know if you noticed this, you probably can't because of where you're at, but the spacing between each handle is not the same. So so it's not even, and that's another thing to keep in mind is that people, when you're looking for patterns, sometimes those patterns don't, they don't exist for a reason. Like the reason that there's a wider grip here is so that people with bigger hands can obviously grab it, right? Or they can put them out to the cup, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure it was intentional, but when you look at it, it's very incongruent. Like it doesn't make any, and I would imagine that a lot of that stuff doesn't make sense when you are not faced with, that urgency or that literal, I better do this because the moment depends on it, not just and it leads to, one of the things you do at the end of every chapter in the book, which is super helpful for those reading it because it kind of ties the message in. Kind of like, honestly, TED Talks do this, right? Like you have a certain amount of time is the idea that perspective is powerful and completely within our control. So I'm going to ask you, in your opinion, your theory, why don't people take that advantage of that? Why we try to control the things that won't. Time, for example. We cannot control time. It passes whether we want it to or not. But perspective, which is something that is innately ours, we maybe don't give ourselves the time and space to control as much as or take command over. Why do you think that is? And what is one thing that someone can do if they're thinking about it right away that allows them to maybe get a better handle on it?
Yeah. I think there's a couple of reasons that come to mind of why people don't leverage this super powerful tool, like you said, that actually is something within our control, and a lot of things are not within our control. You said time, weather, how other people act in the world, all those things we can't control. But I think one thing that I've learned, and one reason maybe people don't do this that often, is I have lived many days with my back against the proverbial wall, like struggling to live, struggling to survive, struggling to get to the next day. And through those moments, you build up this fight or flight mechanism that makes you realize some things beyond the obvious. And one of the things that I realized in those moments is that, okay, I can change how I see things. I can change how I view things and how I feel about everything happening around me. And that is so powerful. But frankly, a lot of people don't live in that kind of hand-to-mouth, extreme kind of mode all the time, but I have. And from that, I think I've learned these lessons that I'm trying to tell people, because I even tell myself that now. Like today, I'll tell you is a pretty good and normal day. And I'm very excited to say that. But it's easy for me as well to say, okay, well, then I'm just going to worry about some dumb thing or focus on something that's not really fulfilling my purpose. And so I think that's one reason is people forget, myself included, that, man, if you were told, this is a cliche thing to say, but Mike, if I told you, you have one day to live,
Yep.
you would probably live today differently.
Well,
but I've lived enough of those days
yeah.
that I've kind of put together this thought process on, okay, what can I do differently? I'll get to a couple of those things. But the second reason that I think people don't leverage this power that's in our control is simply because some of the things I'm going to say sound silly, sound weird, sound like, what? It kind of gives you that take. But I'm telling you, when you are hanging by a thread, you do things out of desperation. But those same things are very powerful when you're not hanging by a thread. So, a couple of examples. If you're having, a really big challenge or a challenge that's big to you, even if you don't think the world would see it as big. By the way, challenges are relative. Don't compare them. If it's hard for you, it's hard, period. But when you're doing, handling those challenges and thinking about things, ask yourself something as mundane but so powerful as, what are 5 ways it could be worse? I remember distinctly being in the shower after a really challenging trip to the beach when I could barely walk on a prosthetic foot that was basically carved out of wood, and saying, okay, instead of obsessing over how hard this is and how mad I am and how sad I am, what are 5 ways this could be worse? And I thought of some really easy answers, and that changed how I saw that day. Ask yourself, what's going right? Okay, so I lost a leg. Well, I had another leg. I had modern medical technology to give me a prosthetic to be able to walk on it. If I was born in 1500, that wouldn't have been the case. I would have been on a wooden peg leg like a pirate, which, by the way, is always a Halloween costume I need to do someday. But there are things that are going right, but you choose to see the things that are going wrong. And so there's so many things, but I think people don't do it because it's simple. And frankly, the tyranny of the urgent isn't upon them. Their back isn't against the wall. So it's fascinating to me to leverage these tools day in and day out.
Well, you're talking also about reframing, which you bring up in the book, like the idea of, if you only had a day to live. I mean, you allude to the song "Live Like You Were Dying" by Tim McGraw, which I've listened to that song back when it came out, and it would come back into my purview every once in a while. And I was going through the book. I'm like, oh, right, this song is, and I think I'm pretty sure he wrote that song because his dad was dying, right? Like I know his dad passed away. His dad was a famous big league pitcher, Tug McGraw, and he died of cancer. And there might have been some kind of correlation there. I might be conflating the two things. But what you're talking, that reframing is tricky because framing is so ingrained, like the frame itself is so ingrained, right? Like this is the way it should be. This is the way. And when you think about, I love the example of what are 5 worst things that can happen. And the reason is our brain goes there naturally. Our brain goes to the negative. It goes to and that's why because that's the way our brains are wired. We want to, we want to breathe, we want to eat, we want to, those are basic survival things. So we're wired to look for the negative, and the positive, is obviously super helpful, but most people would tend to go, well, how could this be better? Or what is going right in my life? So that reframing, which I've not really heard anybody talk about to the same degree that you just did, I think can be incredibly helpful. And it allows you to look at things from, it's the whole, the enlightenment thing that Steven Pinker talks about, where he, people are like, the world has never been a worse place. Really? No. I mean, when you look at it, when you zoom out, when you have perspective,
oh my gosh,
right? So I want to touch on. I've dog-eared this book like crazy, but when you talk about vulnerability, which is a huge topic, you mentioned Brene Brown. I've got several of her things here. I mean, watching Ted Lasso and seeing her get name dropped there multiple times was a big treat. But the Roosevelt speech and the idea of vulnerability, to me, is that the key initially to unlocking perspective? Is that the switch that needs to be either continuously flipped so that you can maintain the ability to gain perspective or gather it? Or is it the one that, is the toughest to switch, so you switch it last? Like, I know that we've organized the book in such a way vulnerability comes next, but I wonder where vulnerability fits in terms of the you mentioned simple and easy, right? Like simple isn't always easy. So to me, it seems like it's the most challenging to kind of adopt in order to tap into the gift of perspective. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so many good things there. Real quick on the Tim McGraw song before I get into the
Mm-hmm.
vulnerability question, it was interesting. I like country music and a lot of different music. So I'd heard that song a million times, but it is interesting how things hit you when you're in that situation. And when I heard that song after I was essentially diagnosed with a very, very challenging situation, and that song talks about I was in my early 40s. Well, I was in my early 40s. And it talked about how, oh my gosh, you're kind of back to that clear the mechanism moment. Everything stops when you hear that kind of news. But then what that song beautifully does is it harnesses it and switches it up and it says, hey, but you know what? Now I have this gift. I live every day like I'm dying. And I try to remind myself of that and I fail. And when I have a normal day, which is an amazing blessing and gift, I don't always close every day and said, man, I went Rocky Mountain climbing and I rode a bull today and I was so nice and perfect to everybody. But just reminding yourself, because of course I don't do that every day, that's the goal, right? To act like this might be the last day. It's a great mindset to consider. So that's just a fun refresher of that. But I love that thought about vulnerability, where it kind of comes in the sequence. And, I think it just depends on how you're wired. So perspective in my mind is almost the foundation of everything else because it's internal and it's external. It can be the quiet of how your brain processes things. It can be the way you respond outwardly to others. It really is the Rubik's Cube of you looking at something head on. And though it might look like a complete challenge, maybe if you turn it 10 degrees to the right, you see, okay, maybe this is an opportunity for something. But to me, vulnerability is just that openness, that desire and courage to open yourself up. And maybe at first that's only in your own heart and mind. To your point, Mike, maybe that's to say, okay, I'm going to allow myself to have that worst case scenario thought. I mean, I've done that. I've sat with my own feelings and said, okay, what if I do die at 44 years old with two middle school kids? That's a very vulnerable thing to let your brain ask that and answer that. But, sometimes that's better to do than to just put it in this little dark box and fear it and never open it up. I have been vulnerable with the sense of telling my story, writing it all down in the book. I mean, you've read it. You've seen that there's things in there that are embarrassing to share, but I'm like, you know what? It's real and everybody has those things. So just put them out there. But some people aren't going to be comfortable with that. I think vulnerability is a spectrum. It doesn't have to mean you're an oversharer. It doesn't have to mean you're a person who doesn't want to be private. It's unique to each of us. So whether that's being vulnerable in your own heart and mind, being vulnerable with your spouse, your partner, your kids, your boss, telling them, hey, the reason I've been taking a lot of PTO lately is because I think I might have cancer. Maybe that's a step in vulnerability for somebody. And that would, I promise you, 99% of the time create a more supportive environment. Or maybe it's somebody like me who believes that my purpose lies in being vulnerable with others. So I think it's a spectrum for all of us. And I think the sequence in which it comes is unique to yourself and your circumstances. But all of these factors play a role. And, it's a complete dimension of what tool you choose to bring in at what time.
Right. And, when you go through the book, if you were to go, like, again, when you pick up the book, not if you pick up the book, but when you pick up the book, there's obviously there's like 7 specific kind of chapters that focus on different things. It's so fascinating that I didn't choose intentionally to watch this film last night that I watched, but it seems fitting that I did. It was on my list. I've been reading. I picked up Oliver Sacks's book, "The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat." Although "The Man Who Mistook His Hat for His Wife" might also be a funny title. And in that story, he talks about the Awakenings thing, which I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Awakenings with Robin Williams and Robert De Niro. It is from like 1993, I want to say, early 90s, and spoiler alert, if you haven't watched it yet, everybody, by the way, you've had like 30 had a long time to watch it, so I'm going to spoil. But it's based on a true story of patients who had encephalitis, right, which was debilitating to the point where they're basically catatonic, and they're living inside this shell. And the premise is they use a drug to kind of, and this is the doctor character played by Robin Williams, which is based on Oliver Sacks. To fast forward, it does unlock something in the Robert De Niro character where he starts to come back to life, like he awakens. The whole story, the underpinning is the simple things in life matter so much. Like this person, when you were trapped in that state, all of the people that had that were frozen essentially in time. Like, so they were appreciating things like looking at nature, going dancing, falling in love, like all those things that, and even just being able to go for a walk, right? Like those things that we take for granted. So I'm watching this film last night and getting rather emotional because I've been, it's kind of, and I'm like, this, like the perspective that, and spoiler alert, the drug only works for a limited amount of time. So eventually everything goes back, which sucks. But that's not what everyone focuses on. At the end, they focus on the fact that they were able to live in the moments that they had available to them. And they reveled in the simple things. They reveled in those. So to me, that the reason I bring this up is that I think that in the hustle and bustle, you mentioned the normal day, like, and you've even said this, and alluded to this, like, as I'm looking at it, like the body language is like, my day was normal, but that's a gift. Like that is a gift. And it leads me to this whole concept of journaling, which I'm a huge believer in. So you've obviously chronicled your story here, but do you actually keep like a journal of sorts to kind of, keep that perspective aligned and attuned?
Gosh, again, you give me so many things that I want. Like my brain is like popping with thoughts. But
you're adding it to your letterboxd right now. Awakenings. I must watch.
Exactly. I'm like, I have not watched that, but
it's
now
on
that's
Netflix,
gonna happen.
By the way. It's on Netflix.
Okay.
So there you go.
All right. Good. Side note: this week is Friday is my birthday, and I told my family, freshman son, 14-year-old son, a 12-year-old daughter, and my husband. I said, all I want for my birthday is for you all to sit down and watch my favorite movie with me, which is Hoosiers, and they never want to watch it. And so
same era.
That's like my whole birthday gift.
Exactly. Yeah. Same era with Dennis Hopper, all that. Oh yeah. That's great. Gene Hackman. Oh yeah. Yes. Brilliant.
Yes. I think, by the way, I love that because I grew up in a tiny town and which, I love sports. I love the underdog. And growing up in said tiny town, I didn't get to go to the movie theater very much. So I saw like 5 movies in the theater growing up, and that was one of them, which is the whole thing about experiences in life, right? How they change you. But I'll watch Awakenings on my own and still make them watch Hoosiers with me.
There you go.
But to your, to everything you're saying on just that notion of the things we take for granted, I'll give you a couple of stories. One of them was when I was in the hospital, actually before my lung transplant. And frankly, the doctors were just trying to keep me as stable as possible while I waited on this amazing gift of a lifetime. And my husband, had to kind of come and go. I was in St. Louis. We live in Kansas City. That's where I had my lung transplant. So he was trying to take care of the kids and me. So different people would come and kind of help him. But one time when he was there, I'd been inside those hospital walls for so many days. I said, it was June and it was at a sunny day out my window. And I said, I just want to go outside. So he took me, and I couldn't walk without, a major oxygen, and it was just too far. So I was in a wheelchair, and he wheeled me out, and I just sat, Mike, in the sun, and just for 10 minutes felt that sun on my body. And it was the smallest thing. I mean, most of you right now, if you're, in a climate that has sun, or you're listening to this in the daytime, you could do that. No big deal. That was everything to me. Or after my lung transplant, when I literally wasn't allowed to leave my room because I was hooked up to 5 million things, drainage tubes coming out of my chest and monitors galore and a feeding tube and all this junk. I also couldn't leave my room just logistically. But when some of that got pulled out of me, I was able to leave. And my parents took me to just this walkway in the hospital. And it was raining outside. And it was like the biggest gift mentally to just see outside and see rain. So I say all that to not be like, oh, don't feel bad for me or whatever. I'm doing great. I'm so thankful and feel like I've received a miracle. I say that to underscore when you are having a day where you feel like you're running around and stressed, or you're annoyed with something, or you feel like you have all these emails, just stop for 30 seconds, 5 minutes, and just be like, oh my gosh, like you said, I can breathe, I can see, I can taste, I can go outside. Like the rest of it, I always tell people the emails are really not that bad. Like, just chill out. It's okay. Or the fact your kid didn't make the team. It's like, okay. I mean, I deal with those things too, but just take that breath. And to your question, my answer in journalism is, I would say, sort of. Right. I'm not going to, say that I had this beautiful journal and amazing penmanship and write something every day. I wish I did. But what I do, this might be a hack for somebody like me who doesn't do that. I write notes on my phone. And so I'll lay there at night. And if I think of something like, wow, like I have, for instance, zillions of notes on my phone. One of them is just called miracles. And I write down the things that I feel like that, God did for me in my life that were not happenstance. Like, for instance, when I was on the lung transplant list, I was supposed to have a really bad antibody profile. They're like, have you had a baby? Yes. Have you had a blood transfusion? Yes. When I got my leg amputation, have you had XYZ? I'm like, yes, yes, yes. They're like, well, you're going to have this really hard antibody profile. Shockingly, I didn't. So I was an easy match for a lung transplant, as an example.
Right.
So I have a list like that. I have a list of, thoughts that come to my mind that have eventually led to the book. And so I journal in sort of a modern notes phone way.
Mm-hmm.
But to your point, I love that I do that. Otherwise, you don't have anything to kind of capture and look back on. And some days I look at those things and it, shocker, changes my perspective to look at those notes.
Well, there's two things. Number one, I think you would love Awakenings, so I hope you add that to your list of movies
Done
to watch.
and done.
Secondly, you're in Kansas City, so I imagine you're a Chiefs fan, right? As a sports
Yes,
fan?
of course.
I'm a Bengals fan, so
Can we still continue this conversation?
Still continue
can
this
we
conversation.
still be friends?
We still have a winning record, so we're okay right now.
Oh my gosh, one of my coworkers lives in Cincinnati, and she and I were chatting last week, and I was like, "Oh, Joe Burrows is going to get healthy. Everything's going to be good. It's going to be great."
Not so much. Both my sports teams that were expected to do well this year have been racked with injuries. The Bengals, obviously, which, you know what? Again, so this is perspective. This is a good example. I actually have a YouTube video that I'll link to in the show notes about, like, now that my team isn't, what can you do with the time that you don't have between week 17?
There you go.
There is 108 hours of football time from the end of the regular season until week 1, right? Not counting preseason, which they don't count, but you know what I mean? And if you don't make the playoffs, if you make the playoffs, it's less, but still 108. What can I do with that 108 hours? That's number one. Number two, the Bengals finished dead last in a division that is the most, frankly, the most competitive division in football. They were 9-8. They're the last place team, which means they get a last place schedule next year, and they have an amazing tip. Yes, they have holes, but they're going to have Burrow back in theory. Like, they're going to have all. They're going to be facing teams that don't have those kind of weapons. So the Bengals, I would not be at all surprised if they go from like last place to Super Bowl again in the following year, or I'll say for your benefit, AFC Championship against the Chiefs. But but the point is that perspective allows me to not go, oh, it sucks they're not in the playoffs, like all that stuff. What does suck is every other AFC North team is in the playoffs, but as long as the Steelers and Ravens go out early, especially the Steelers, I'm okay with that. But the other team that's racked with injuries is the New Jersey Devils. That's my hockey team, and they've been hit hard with injuries too. Interestingly enough, the New Jersey Devils started their franchise in Kansas City as the Kansas City Scouts, back in '74, which was the year I was born. So, I mean, it's the pause, like you mentioned, that matters because, and we're so bad at that because we're not good at measuring the length of time. We're good at quantifying, like, emails. Like, I have 33 emails, I get to 0. We're good at that. We're good at the math of that. I do an exercise, and I've mentioned this on several episodes before, where I'll say, hey, we're going to take 60 seconds to do nothing. Absolutely nothing. And we just sit there. And after I ask people, how'd that feel? And some people are like, restful, calming. Some people go, waste of time, anxious. Like, you get all. And then I say, for those that, and then I said, how many of you meditate? And then I would get a smattering of responses. And they said, how'd that feel? Like, it didn't feel like a minute. It didn't feel like a minute. I'm like, because it was only 42 seconds. So I basically frame it in that people are like, oh, wow, I thought that. I'm like, if you were freaking out because you thought it was a minute, but it's only 42, like, that felt forever for you. It just goes to show how not good we are at, like, because you said take 5 minutes. Some people are like, 5 minutes. It's that old adage of the business person who says to the Buddha, I really could use some meditation time. And the Buddha says, well, take 5 minutes a day. And like, oh my God, I don't have time for 5 minutes a day. And the Buddha goes, well, take 20. Right? Like, that's the point. Like, if you're that frazzled, you need more. But you've got, and this is kind of a nice segue into near the tail end of the book, because I want to make ssure I'm respectful of your time, but the brands of belief. Because these things that you all go through, the categories here, none of these are quantitative at face value. They're very qualitative, which is hard for people who are trying to be, quote, more productive and be great with managing their time. But these 5 elements that you talk about, 6 if you count the middle one, because I think there's like there's a conjunction there. They, to me, are, by practicing them, the qualitative aspects will help you increase the quantitative in what matters. So can we talk about those briefly before we wrap up, these brands of belief that you share?
For sure. I will say, knowing to your point, this is all about being productive, just to kind of lead in with that. I just want to underscore what you're saying, Mike. I mean, I would argue that, if you just looked at the things that a person accomplishes in their life, I'll use my life as the example since we're talking about it through this book. There's a lot of things that to date I have accomplished that, XYZ on paper. But I also will tell you that I've done that. Not always. When I was younger, I was definitely the work too hard, never get home on time. We all learn those things. But I will tell you that now it's 47 on Friday, since it's my birthday week.
Happy birthday, by the way.
Thank you. I feel like I'm so much more productive by bringing in those qualitative levers. And so I just want to keep underscoring everything you're talking about on this whole podcast, Mike, is it doesn't have to be checklist and scheduling everything. That sometimes is not the way to productivity. I think wisdom shows you that there are other means. Once again, the whole work smarter, not harder, focus on what matters. Those things sound easy, but under each of them are very, very layered ideas that you need to think about how to apply to your life. But on these qualitative brands of belief, and for those of you who haven't read the book yet, they are things like how you find a way to believe. And I talk about engaging your soul to really, overcome things and to have a new lease on life. One of them, for instance, is doing. Go do something you don't think you can do. So, for instance, for me, that was ziplining, with a new prosthetic leg. And I tell the story in there, but that helped me believe. There's other examples in there about asking and receiving. Sometimes you might not think that you can get that job or go on that trip or overcome this challenge, but others who know you probably do see something you don't see. Ask them. It might sound silly, but I would ask my family, do you think I can do this? And that this was implied in overcome these hard challenges. And when I didn't think I could believe, they thought I could. So those are 2 of them. The most important one to me was about trusting. And that to me was all about faith. Back to your example about, the Buddha example or the monk, or in my case, just letting God take control, taking a moment and breathing and realizing that whether we want to believe it or not, we're not in control of everything. And that alone is a powerful notion. Sometimes just trust that things can work out. That gives you that time to pause and say, I can't scramble and do all of this myself. And to me, that's been the biggest lesson I've learned in total. So yes, these brands of belief that seem qualitative will take you to a different dimension than just trying to have tasks and checklists and tick marks and all of that good stuff.
Yeah, it leads to
By the way,
it leads to the idea real quick. It leads to the idea of being productive instead of doing productive, which is something that I espouse.
Love that. I love that. I'm going to write that down. And my little notes tonight, Mike, that made my phone app notes. I do have to also give you a compliment. One of the concepts in the book we didn't talk about was hidden advantages, which is how can you find the good and the bad? And your whole soliloquy on the bingo season and the time you get back and all the data behind that, you have an MBA in finding a hidden advantage. I think amazing. Well done.
Well, I appreciate that. And I appreciate that you taking the time to have this conversation with me today. The book is called The Gift of Perspective, Wisdom I Gained from Losing a Leg and 2 Lungs. Lindsey, where can people pick up the book and where can they keep up with you and what you've got going on?
Thank you for the question. The book is on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. You can find information about it on Goodreads. So basically, wherever you get your books, it's available in ebook and hardback. As far as more information, I have a website, lindseyroy.com, LindseyRoy. By the way, Mike, I think the name Roy/Wa in Quebec is a big name up there. And so those of you that are French Canadian, those are my roots. But anyway, lindseyroy.com, or you can follow me on Instagram, lindseyroy26, or on LinkedIn, Lindsey Roy. So I'm really excited to meet those of you who are interested in this podcast, because I think it's just such a cool concept that you have here, Mike.
Thank you so much. And thanks for having a productive conversation with me today.
Thank you.
Big thanks to Lindsey for joining me on the program. You could check out the show notes and all that fun stuff wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or you can go to productivityist.com/podcast 519. Get them there as well. But of course, if you're listening to this on a device, then just subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. That way you don't miss a single episode. Find the show notes quickly and easily, and can easily also get to the archives, which a plethora of guests as we head into the 10th year, completing the 10th year. Can you believe it? Of a productive conversation, formerly known as the Productivityist podcast. Next week, we'll dive a bit more into that. But for now, I want to dive into another way that you can support the show, and that's to check out the sponsors you heard during today's episode. Just go to productivityist.com/podcast sponsors to check them out. Click on any of the links if something resonates with you. That way they know that we sent you. Until next time, I'm Mike Vardy, the host of A Productive Conversation, reminding you to stop doing productive and start being productive. See you later.